Welcome to Trump Wire, your trusted source for breaking headlines, global insights, and sharp analysis from around the world. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. On a September morning in 2025, a shocking alert hit Maine's coastal towns. Canada was immediately banning all U.S. lobster imports. The news struck like lightning, instantly severing a lifeline for the U.S. lobster industry. For generations, American fishermen relied on Canadian processors to handle their massive summer catches, keeping the industry afloat. Suddenly, trucks full of live lobster were turned away at the border, their cargo losing value by the minute. Buyers called fishermen on the water, telling them to stop hauling traps. There was nowhere for the lobster to go. The cross-border partnership perfected over decades was shattered in a single political act, leaving the docks eerily silent and an entire industry paralyzed. This was more than a trade dispute, it was an economic crisis with no warning and no clear way out. At the heart of the crisis lies the so-called gray zone, a 277 square mile patch of ocean wedged between the coast of Maine and New Brunswick. This stretch of water, seemingly tranquil from above, is anything but peaceful beneath the surface. For generations it has been a place where boundaries blur and tensions simmer, a maritime no-man's land that has shaped the lives of those who depend on it. The gray zone is home to some of the world's richest lobster grounds, a natural bounty that has drawn fishermen from both sides of the border for decades. The cold, nutrient-rich waters here create the perfect environment for lobsters to thrive, making this area a vital economic lifeline for coastal communities in both the United States and Canada. For over a century, both the US and Canada have laid claim to Makia Seal Island and the surrounding waters. The island itself is little more than a rocky outcrop, but its strategic location has made it a symbol of sovereignty and national pride. Despite the lack of a formal agreement, both nations have operated under a tense, unwritten truce, each maintaining a presence on the island and in the waters around it. Over the years, fishermen from both countries have worked these waters, their trap lines often crisscrossing and overlapping. This uneasy coexistence has required a delicate balance, competition tempered by a mutual dependence on the sea's abundance. For many, the gray zone has been both a source of livelihood and a test of neighborly restraint. But as lobster populations soared and global demand sent prices to record highs, the stakes grew higher, the once manageable rivalry intensified with more boats crowding the waters and more traps set than ever before. The fragile peace that had held for decades began to unravel, replaced by suspicion and growing resentment. Accusations of trap cutting, gear sabotage, and territorial encroachment mounted on both sides. What was once a shared resource became a battleground, with livelihoods and local identities hanging in the balance. The gray zone, once a symbol of uneasy cooperation, now echoed with the sounds of conflict. Canadian officials, alarmed by what they saw as increasing American encroachment and unsustainable fishing practices, began to push for a tougher stance. Patrols increased, regulations tightened, and the rhetoric on both sides grew sharper as each nation sought to defend its interests and its fishermen. The legal ambiguity of the gray zone, where no clear border exists, became a powder keg of economic rivalry and national pride. With no definitive resolution in sight, every season brought new disputes, legal challenges, and diplomatic skirmishes, further fueling the sense of uncertainty and mistrust. In this charged atmosphere, it was only a matter of time before tensions exploded into open conflict, threatening not just the livelihoods of fishermen, but the fragile relationship between two neighboring nations. In the summer of 2024, the uneasy peace in the gray zone collapsed. Tensions that had simmered for years finally erupted, as the fragile balance between Canadian and American fishermen shattered almost overnight. The disputed waters, once a place of wary coexistence, became a battleground where every encounter carried the risk of violence. Canadian fisheries officers reported a surge in violent confrontations with American fishermen, threats with weapons, flares fired at patrol boats, and coordinated acts of intimidation. What began as heated arguments over trap lines quickly escalated into dangerous standoffs, with both sides unwilling to back down. The sense of lawlessness grew as more incidents went unpunished, fueling a cycle of retaliation. Officers faced harassment at sea and threats to their families on land, creating a climate of fear. Some officers reported being followed home, their families receiving anonymous phone calls and messages. The conflict was no longer confined to the water. It had invaded their personal lives, leaving many feeling isolated and vulnerable. The Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans launched investigations into illegal U.S. traps deep in Canadian waters, a bold escalation. Officers worked around the clock, often under threat, to document violations and remove unauthorized gear. Each trap pulled from the sea was a symbol of the growing defiance and disregard for international boundaries. The unwritten rules were gone, might now dictated the terms. The sea became a place where only the boldest dared to work, and every day brought new risks. Fishermen armed themselves, and patrols became more frequent and more heavily equipped. Faced with armed fishermen and open defiance, Canada saw its sovereignty and the safety of its officers under direct threat. The government could no longer ignore the escalating danger as the situation threatened to spiral out of control and draw in even more players. The violence at sea became the final straw, providing the political justification for drastic action. Public outcry grew as images of clashes and injured officers spread across the media, demanding a strong response from Ottawa. The conflict was no longer just about Lobster, it was about law, order, and national pride. Communities on both sides of the border rallied, holding protests and demanding protection for their livelihoods and their way of life. Canada prepared to respond with unprecedented force. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of diplomacy, resolve, and the very meaning of sovereignty in the gray zone. By September 2024, the danger had become too great for Canadian fisheries officers. Dozens invoked their right to refuse unsafe work, citing escalating violence and a lack of protection. This wasn't a strike for better pay, it was a desperate stand for safety. With up to 35% of Marine Patrol agents refusing duty, Canada's ability to police its own waters was crippled. The government scrambled to maintain enforcement, but the message was clear: the situation was out of control. The officers' refusal exposed a critical vulnerability and forced Ottawa's hand. Unable to guarantee safety at sea, Canada turned to economic warfare. Canada responded with a sweeping crackdown, determined to assert its authority over its waters and protect its fishing industry. The days of quiet tolerance were over. Canadian officials, frustrated by years of encroachment and escalating tensions, decided to act decisively and publicly. New patrol vessels hit the water, aggressively seizing U.S. traps and gear. Millions of dollars lost overnight for American fishermen. The Coast Guard and fisheries officers worked around the clock, pulling up hundreds of traps and confiscating equipment. For many U.S. lobstermen, it was a shocking wake-up call. The era of tolerance was over. Canadian enforcement was now public and relentless. Officers boarded vessels, checked licenses, and made their presence unmistakable. The message was clear: the rules had changed, and Canada was no longer willing to look the other way. On land, the government prepared its ultimate weapon: a total ban on U.S. lobster imports. At a tense press conference, officials announced sweeping new restrictions, signaling a dramatic escalation in the conflict. The move was calculated to inflict maximum economic pain, targeting the American industry's reliance on Canadian processing. Without access to Canadian plants, U.S. lobsters piled up, unable to reach international markets. When the ban was announced, it was a non-violent but devastating blow, turning the U.S. catch into a perishable liability. Lobsters spoiled on docks, and fishermen watched helplessly as their livelihoods slipped away. Canada's message was clear: if it couldn't control the water, it would control the border. The hard line at customs became a symbol of national resolve, and the border itself transformed into a front line in the lobster war. The lobster war had moved from the sea to the marketplace. Markets that once bustled with activity now stood eerily quiet, and the economic shockwaves rippled through coastal communities on both sides. The blockade was a powerful show of sovereignty, using trade as a weapon. Canadian officials stood firm even as protests erupted and tempers flared along the border. The American industry was left reeling, with no easy way to recover. For many, the future of their way of life was suddenly uncertain, as the hard border and economic blockade changed the rules of the game overnight. The lobster war erupted amid a deepening U.S.-Canada rift. The return of Donald Trump and his America First policies strained the alliance, with new tariffs and hostile rhetoric fueling distrust. Canadian leaders from Trudeau to Carney warned of U.S. economic aggression and vowed to resist. The U.S. pushed for dominance over North American resources, stoking Canadian fears of annexation. In this toxic climate, the lobster dispute became a proxy for national identity and independence. Diplomacy gave way to confrontation, and public anger on both sides escalated the conflict. When Canada banned U.S. lobster, it was more than trade policy. It was a defiant political statement. The relationship was fractured, and the lobster war became a symbol of a much deeper divide. The ban's impact was immediate and brutal. With the border closed, U.S. processing plants were overwhelmed and lobster prices crashed. Fishermen couldn't cover their costs, boats sat idle and coastal economies unraveled. Generations-old businesses faced bankruptcy, and families struggled to survive. The sense of betrayal and anger ran deep, at Canada for the ban, and at the U.S. government for failing to protect them. The collapse threatened a long-term seafood crisis and the iconic Maine lobster brand itself. Without a diplomatic breakthrough, the industry faced a painful, uncertain future. Silent docks and empty traps stood as stark reminders of a thriving industry brought to its knees by conflict and broken politics.